This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas, and this is Chapter 2 of Catcher in the Rye.
Thrilled to be back talking about The Catcher in the Rye. Happens to be my favorite novel to teach, so we're going to talk about Chapter 2 here today. Before we get into things, though, I am going to give a huge shout out to Garden of English's Patreon supporters. You're going to see their names on this side of the screen over here. I am super grateful for them, and by all means, if you're interested in supporting the Garden of English in this way, you can go to the website right across the bottom, and I encourage you to do so. Before we get into Chapter 2 for today, I would like to address something from my Chapter 1 Catcher in the Rye video. If you haven't seen that, you're going to want to check it out up here. So I filmed that video and I talked about one of the allusions that first shows up to David Copperfield, and somebody had tossed a comment down the bottom about something that I had totally forgot about in relation to David Copperfield, and that is that David Copperfield, the main character, was born in the Call. And now, interestingly enough, I don't think that that's necessarily the only reason why Holden alludes to David Copperfield, as I explained in my last video. But that is something that I totally forgot about. I haven't read the book since I was like 21 years old. I'm 35 now, so it's been 14 years. Small detail to miss, especially when it was in the first chapter, and the book is so ridiculously long. But I want to talk about that, because David Copperfield was indeed born in the Call. And if that is actually the case, which it is, what the Call is that's actually being born like in the amniotic sac, and it's very, very rare for that to happen. But essentially, you're born in the membrane that you are in the womb, essentially. I'm not going to show you pictures because it can get a little graphic and stuff like that. But basically, you're basically born with a protective membrane around you, essentially. So imagine like a baby in a balloon that's kind of like stuck to it, and that's kind of what it looks like. And so that might not mean anything to you right now, but it will probably mean something to you in the future if you think about this idea of a protective membrane and being surrounded by it. So that might be something that we want to actually consider, and I will tell you that it does indeed relate. Also, you're going to notice that our main character is Holden Caulfield, and there is a reason why that is the case. His name is indeed quite symbolic, and we will journey into that throughout our video series. So that's just one of the things that I wanted to know. Now, let's actually get into Chapter 2, though, because that's what we are looking for here for today. So Chapter 2, we get to a lot more exposition about the character of who Holden is, and that's how this chapter actually functions. Let's actually look at the character of Holden, and really we start to recognize his complexities right away. Now, please note there are 3 different types of character complexity that I cover in this video right up here, and I want to talk about Holden here as being the type of complex character that is incredibly contradictory, okay? And I want to go into some reasons as to how we know such things. So if I go in my book, Catcher in the Rye, and I look in Chapter 2, one of the first things that Holden does is he talks about Old Spencer, and he talks about Old Spencer having this Navajo blanket. So I'm going to read this here. It says, if you thought about him just enough and not too much, you could figure out that he wasn't doing too bad for himself. And he's talking about his old history teacher. And he says, for instance, one Sunday, when some other guys and I were over there for hot chocolate, he showed us this old beat-up Navajo blanket that he and Mrs. Spencer bought off some Indian in Yellowstone Park. Then it drops down and it says, he was sitting in a big leather chair, all wrapped up in that blanket I just told you about. And it also tells us here, it says, you could tell Old Spencer got a bang out of buying it. That's what I mean. You take somebody old like Old Spencer, and they can get a bang out of buying a blanket. Now, sure enough, that might mean nothing to you right now, but one of the things about Holden is that he's such a hypocrite, and he contradicts himself all the time, and you're like, well, how has he contradicted himself with this old blanket so far? Well, you haven't found that out yet because you haven't got Chapter 3. But I will tell you, once we start seeing Holden's red hunting hat show up, what's a red hunting hat, you ask? Oh, this is a red hunting hat. Once you see Holden's red hunting hat show up, you're going to understand why this is such a big deal. Because it seems as though he's criticizing Old Spencer for getting a bang out of just buying this blanket while he's been out, and then actually enveloping himself in this blanket. But sure enough, we're going to notice that Holden does the same exact thing. He gets a real bang out of buying something that he got for very cheap, and he actually envelops himself in it a lot. And we're going to check that out as the book goes on. But that's the first thing we want to recognize, right? So we see him almost criticizing Old Spencer for something like this, as if it's like a menial thing that he does, but Holden's going to be doing the same thing in the future. And if you've read this book before, then you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, well, you're going to see it very, very soon. I'm going to try not to include too many spoilers, but I am going to go through this piece like you are probably familiar with the rest of the book. Well, let's look at some other areas where Holden is actually quite hypocritical in this piece. On page 15 in my book, right, Holden is talking about, he's already talking with Mr. Spencer, and they're in there, and Mr. Spencer is clearly trying to help see this kid off with some friendly advice. And sure enough, Holden is hearing him talk, and Mr. Spencer is consistently calling him boy, or at least that's what Holden wants us to believe, because don't forget, we are getting this from Holden's perspective. He's thinking back on it, and I'm not sure we should fully trust Holden. He might be an unreliable narrator, but we'll see as we continue. But sure enough, as Mr. Spencer keeps on giving him advice, and he keeps on saying boy and boy and boy, Holden actually says here, he says, "I wish he'd stop calling me boy all the time." So Holden is actually ridiculously critical of that. But interestingly enough, if I just go back to page 13, let's look at what Holden actually says here. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not actually 13. Let me see. It's on page 11, right? Holden was talking about how he had gone to multiple different boarding schools, and this Pensy was like the fourth one that he was getting kicked out of. And it says right here, Holden says, "I shook my head because I shake my head quite a lot. And boy, I said." I also say boy quite a lot. So sure enough, he's really upset about Mr. Spencer saying the word boy and calling him boy all the time. And Holden's like, "I just say it all the time." Right? Now, is it possible that Holden is not saying this in necessarily a demeaning way? Yes, of course. And did Holden potentially feel demeaned by Mr. Spencer? Yes, of course. My point here, though, is that there's a clear contradiction that is drawn out in the actual language of chapter 2, right? Mr. Spencer says boy all the time. Holden's upset with it, right? And then Holden's like, "I say boy all the time." Let's also look at something else that Mr. Spencer does, that Holden also does. In fact, I just read it, but Holden criticizes Mr. Spencer for it and actually says it makes him look dumb, and Holden's like, "I just do that all the time." So sure enough, right, Mr. Spencer is giving Holden some advice. He just walks in, and Holden is like, "Oh, I started getting really serious in there," and then all of a sudden Holden says he started, and that'd be Mr. Spencer, started going into his nodding routine. "You never saw anybody nod as much in your life as old Spencer did. You never knew if he was just nodding a lot because he was thinking it all, or just because he was a nice old guy and didn't know his behind from his elbow." And so sure enough, Holden's reflecting on Mr. Spencer just nodding all the time, and he's like, is he dumb? Like, what's going on here, right? So he's projecting these characterizations here, okay? Was he just trying to be nice? Was he, is he dumb? Does he not know anything? And think about that. In Holden's mind as a 16-year-old, right, thinking that an adult doesn't know much of anything. I wonder if that's how 16-year-olds think. Yes, it is. But nonetheless, right, maybe Mr. Spencer actually knew a little bit of something. But if I just go over one page, look at what Holden says about himself. I had already read this, right? He says, "I shook my head. I shake my head quite a lot." Well, what do you think Holden's doing right there when he's shaking his head? Just kind of like going like this? No, he's nodding. He's nodding as Mr. Spencer is talking, and we see this throughout the entire scene. So Holden's criticizing Mr. Spencer for nodding as if he doesn't know anything, and then Holden's talking about how he knows what's going on, but Holden is sitting there nodding as well. What a hypocrite. What a contradiction. And yet, that is exactly who Holden is. Now, let's talk about Holden a little bit more in this particular chapter. We do actually find out that he has a patch of gray hair on the side of his head. And sure enough, as he's talking about that, he says here, "I act like I'm 13. He talks about how he's 17 as he's telling the story, but the story was when he was 16, and he says, "I act like I'm 13. He says, "It's ironical because I'm 6'2" and a half, and I have gray hair. I really do. One side of my head, the right side, is full of millions of gray hairs. I've had them ever since I was a kid, and yet I still act sometimes like I was only 12. Now, notice he does mention the ages of 13 and 12. Those are very important ages. We're going to see why once we see a picture of Holden's brother who's not named DB. In Chapter 1, we hear about DB, but Holden has another brother, and we want to actually check him out. 12 and 13 are very important ages here. But sure enough, right, as we keep going in here, it says, everybody says that. Right? Sometimes I only act about 12. He says, everybody says that, especially my father. So now we actually see there might be some tension with Dad here, right? Dad does not think Holden is mature enough. And then we have, it's partly true too, but it isn't all true. People always think something's all true. So Holden is actually making an astute observation here as he's recognizing, like, things are not always one way or the other. So he makes this astute observation, and yet in his contradictory character, because he's complex and he's growing up, if you read throughout this entire chapter, he is actually accusing things of being all one way or all another way throughout the whole chapter. So we start to really see how this is being developed throughout the piece, right? And then sure enough, I wanted to point out one other element of Holden's character, and that is that as Mr. Spencer dives in to talk about how he's been suspended from, how Holden's been suspended from other schools, and Holden brings up about the Wheaton School and a couple of the other schools, Mr. Spencer brings up, like, you've been failing out. And Holden says, no, I actually quit. And one of the things that we're going to have to recognize here is that if that's true, because Holden actually is able to do these sorts of things, then what that means is Holden is actually self-sabotaging, and we need to get to the understanding as to why. And Holden actually even kind of recognizes it, and I think that Mr. Spencer does too. And that's why Mr. Spencer is like, you don't want to know when this is, you don't want to figure this out when it's a little bit too late, Holden. But Holden has a moment of recognizing his self-sabotage, but he doesn't fully embrace it. In fact, he begins to think about other things. So sure enough, we see Holden's complex character throughout this whole story, but that's not the only thing that I want to talk about is his complex character. I want to talk about some of the motifs that seemingly show up throughout the story. Now, if you don't remember what motifs are recurring images, or actually recurring anything that have an influence on the theme, or thematic topics, or thematic insights, or anything of that nature. So basically, a motif is anything that's repeated throughout a story that has some element of meaning, but it's not actually a theme itself. One of the things that I want you to consider as you continue to read The Catcher in the Rye is something that I mentioned last time. I want you to actually look at how many times Holden says the word old. Okay? He says the word old. I want you to recognize how many times he says the word crazy, and I want you to recognize how many times he says the word depressing. Because I think that the more he says these things, those are the ideas that are in his subconscious as he speaks, right? And it just so happens that these are some of the major struggles that he's having throughout our story. So we see this showing up in his language. He does it subconsciously, but sure enough, it's coming out and it's coming through, and that is a motif. Another motif here that we're going to start seeing is Holden when he deals with aging. Okay, the first example is this. He sees Mr. Spencer, and he's reflecting on old Spencer, and he calls him old Spencer, which is weird because we're going to see Holden struggling with the aging process. But a lot of people that he actually has, he holds an endearing sentiment towards, he always calls him old so-and-so, and old so-and-so, and old so-and-so. But he's very uncomfortable with this idea of age and aging. How do I know? Because when he first talks about old Spencer at the beginning of the chapter, he actually reflects on him and he says, you can't think about him too much because you wondered what the heck he was still living for. As if because you're an older individual, you shouldn't have a care to live. But Holden didn't understand, right? Well, why? Let's look at what Holden really has a problem with throughout the chapter. We get a lot of images throughout the chapter that Holden consistently comes back to, and he suggests that these things are bothering him. For example, right? Holden initially says he's sorry he'd come. Why? Because Mr. Spencer was reading the Atlantic Monthly. Well, what's wrong with the Atlantic Monthly besides it's, you're not reading it as a teenager most of the time unless you're in an AP Lang class. But it says he was reading the Atlantic Monthly, and there were pills, and there was medicine all over the place, and everything smelled as Vicks nose drops. It was pretty depressing. Look at that word there. Then he says, I'm not too crazy about sick people anyway. What made it even more depressing, there it shows up again, old Spencer had on this very sad, ratty old bathrobe that he'd probably been born in or something. So as if he's been born in a covering. Oh, my word. What do we call being born in a covering? Oh, a call? Oh, anyway, sorry about that. And then sure enough, right, it says here, I don't much like to see old guys in their pajamas and bathrobes anyway. Their bumpy old chests are always showing, and their legs, old guys' legs at beaches and places that look so white and unhairy. And sure enough, as Holden's going through, we get this picture of old Spencer, right? And we got those little chest hairs scraggly over there, those white hairs that are peeking out and whatnot. But Holden is disgusted because of him looking aged. That's it. And Holden's uncomfortable. He's uncomfortable with aging. And we're going to find out throughout the story that that's something that he's extremely uncomfortable with. So we want to keep an eye on the images of how Holden looks at aging throughout the story, which also brings in a sense of complexity because Holden talks about this idea of maturing and having the gray hair for himself, but that's not actually a bad thing because it suggests that he might kind of be mature. And we see all of this complexity being built in. So we want to look at that. Another thing that we want to look at in here as a motif is the idea of Mr. Spencer being a history teacher. But on top of that, we want to look at what Holden wrote about for his essay. Now, Holden's essay is garbage. I want to make sure that we recognize that right off the bat. But there is something interesting about this essay. I want to talk about what Holden decided to talk about in relation to the Egyptians. It says here, the Egyptians are extremely interesting to us today for various reasons. What a terrible topic sentence. Oh, poor Holden. But anyway, it says, modern science would still like to know what the secret ingredients were that the Egyptians used when they wrapped up dead people so that their faces would not rot for innumerable centuries. This interesting riddle is quite a challenge to modern science in the 20th century. Well, interestingly enough, Holden's talking about how the Egyptians basically embalmed people in order to preserve them and preserve them in history. And we're going to find out very soon that this means a lot to Holden. The idea of preserving things over time. And we're going to see this projected all throughout the story. So one of the things I want you to look out for is, where do we start seeing images about preserving what has been in the past? And sure enough, that's exactly what Holden writes about in his essay, In and of Itself. Preserving something in its single state and how that's so mysterious. So we want to look at that, okay? Another thing that we're going to want to look for that's repeated throughout the whole book is this. We want to look at Holden actually projecting his feelings onto other people. One of the things that I find so ridiculous, because I am a teacher, is Holden talking about how he'd written a note to Mr. Spencer on the bottom of his exam so that Mr. Spencer wouldn't feel too bad about flunking him. He's projecting, yeah, I think that Mr. Spencer will feel bad about flunking me because he really likes me. So because of that, I'm going to write him a note to make it seem better. Then even later, Holden recounts, he's like, well, you could see, and this is after Mr. Spencer is trying to go over the note with him. He's like, you could see that Mr. Spencer really felt pretty lousy about flunking me. I promise you right now, Mr. Spencer couldn't have cared less about flunking Holden because he didn't do the work to get the good grade, right? It has nothing to do with feeling good or bad about failing somebody as a teacher. If it's good, it's good. If it's not good, it's not, and we move on. That has nothing to do with how I view you as a human being. It's just the work that's in front of me. And I assure you it was the same for Mr. Spencer. And the reason why I know is because Mr. Spencer is seemingly a really, really good guy. So next, right, I want to just also point out one last thing, and this is the most important part that shows up in chapter 2. It also deals with Holden being a hypocrite as well. But sure enough, as Mr. Spencer is going through his lecture and Holden is just nodding and trying to, get in and out of there and whatnot and actually be a phony himself, right? He does bring something up, and this is so incredibly important. He talks about how in the middle of the lecture, that the funny thing is, though, that's Holden, was sort of thinking of something else while I shot the bull. I live in New York, and I was thinking about the lagoon in Central Park, down near Central Park South. I was wondering if it would be frozen over when I got home. And if it was, where did the ducks go? I was wondering where the ducks went when the lagoon got all icy and frozen over. I wondered if some guy came in a truck and took them away to a zoo or something, or if they just flew away. Now, interestingly enough, the first thing I want to point out is, sure enough, this is another perfect example of Holden just being a hypocrite. Why? Because he wasn't paying attention to what Old Spencer was saying, and yet a couple pages before, when Old Spencer wasn't paying attention to what Holden was saying, what did he mention? Right? Old Spencer wasn't even listening. He hardly ever listened to you when you said something. So Holden's all jazzed up about that and annoyed, but when Holden does it, it's really not that much of a problem. How do I know that? Because right after Holden talks about the ducks, he says, I'm lucky though. I mean, I could shoot the old bull to Old Spencer and think about those ducks at the same time. Sure enough, Holden's like, well, I can do it. Old Spencer can't, but I can. I'm sharp enough to do that. No, Holden, you're not. You're just a hypocrite, and you're just a phony. And that's actually one of the reasons why we care about you, Holden, because as a teenager, and even as a human being, I am too. If you're a teenager and you're reading this book, you are too. And if you're really annoyed with Holden, the biggest reason why is probably because you're a lot like him. But I want to just point out, this duck question is so ridiculously important, and you're going to see it show up throughout the whole book. And I'm going to tell you something right now. Mr. Spencer actually tries to answer this question. Now you might be like, what? He never mentions ducks at all. No, I know. But Mr. Spencer is trying to answer the question that Holden is really asking. But what is that question that Holden is really asking by asking about the ducks? I'm not going to tell you yet, but I'll tell you within the next few chapters because it's going to show up again quite a few times. So we're going to keep looking out for that because that's a really important motif. If this video was helpful for you at all or gave you any cool insights, I'm going to ask that you actually just click like and subscribe. Why? Because you don't want to miss any of the other chapters that I'm doing with The Catcher in the Rye. I can't pretend it's super exciting to just sit here and listen to me talk about it, but I just love this book so much and I want to make sure that we can get this on record and these cool things. If you noticed anything in chapter 2 that I didn't notice, please make sure that you put it down in the comments down below. Just be kind about it. I'm sick of the snarky comments here as if I've misread something, right? I love to get new ideas about the Catcher in the Rye. Every time I read it, something new pops up. But just like, tell me kindly, hey, let's have a conversation about A, B, C, or D. And I'll try to even put it in my next video, just like I did in my last one. On top of that, you can support the Garden of English in a bunch of ways. You can go to thegardenofenglish.com and know that we have merch and things like that. And I encourage you to actually check out some of that. But you don't have to. You can also follow us on Facebook. You can like us on Instagram and follow us on Instagram as well. And then if you have any other questions about the Catcher in the Rye, put them in the comments right down below, or observations, like I said, because I'd love to have a conversation with you about this, because I love talking about this book. Please note that there are a bunch of companies that do support the Garden of English, or that I like to work with, like Applied Practice and Parlay and Perfection Learning. And you can access links to their materials all down below in the description if you're interested in checking those out. Otherwise, I'm going to see you for Chapter 3 in a couple weeks. So have a great one.